want to kind of keep this fund for things that that really need the fund to survive, really. But just as a quick kind of run through of what we are, this is a 3-year pilot, and as I say, we've already completed the first year. So we started in April of 2019, and we've come to finish off that full year. So we've got 2 years left of this pilot fund. What happens beyond that, we don't know, but we've got a fair idea, and a lot of the things that we've been doing kind of feed into, how this can look in the future. So that's to be, decided at a later date. So the fund is was 57 million of a non-recoupable fund. Obviously, that first year's gone, so we're down 1 year's worth. So we've around about 36 million left. And the purpose of the fund was to support content for UK public service broadcasters, so to reflect UK culture and the identities of young people in the UK today, and anything that would inform them of themselves or the wider world around them, those kind of public service messages, really. And the audience of the content that we were making had to be targeted at 0 to 18-year-olds, inclusive of 18-year-olds. And we felt it was important to have that inclusive 18-year-olds, just so we weren't limited by watersheds and whatnot. Also, this is, as I kind of alluded to, it is a production and development fund. So we asked for the production fund to have a commitment from a qualifying broadcaster, and 50% of at least 50% of the funds in place, and then we can contribute up to 50% of the rest of the budget. In development, I mean, Harry, do you want to talk about development?
Mind, but yeah, with development we can do up to 100% of development funding. We don't need a broadcaster attached. I mean, depending on where you're at, if you're at later stage of development, a conversation with a broadcaster can be helpful, and we can co-fund development with a broadcaster if they are interested. A couple of our projects from our latest development slate, there's As Dead as It Gets from Bryn Coed, and then also Young Beekeepers from Boldover Media. I think you can tell which is which. I'll say just generally about development is that when people apply, we look quite closely at the work being undertaken. So obviously with development, some projects require a lot more material than others, and as we're spending public money, we try and ensure that it's being spent in the most effective way possible. So we like to encourage a step-by-step approach, and this also allows for sort of more of a dialogue with the broadcasters. We look at everything on a case-by-case basis. So for example, if we get a format that's perhaps a bit more is quite different to a broadcaster's existing offering, or the format's not typical of what they usually are, we might encourage a conversation with them earlier in the day. So we might suggest starting with paper development so that you have something to share with them before then going on to sort of more later, more expensive development work. But on that, we have also been known to increase the size of awards as well if we think that would be helpful in gaining that commission. We are able to do additional funding, so if we do come back and suggest starting with paper development, that doesn't mean that's all we're ever going to do. We can do additional funding, and we can process that fairly quickly. With live action, it may be for a redraft of the script. Often with development, you can think it will go one way and it ends up going another way. And then so it will sort of be, you know, for example, we've had some projects that have come to us being quite broad, and then through their research and development work have really found, you know, their target audience and, you know, really honed in on what the project is. And then it might just be a case of quickly updating the materials to better reflect what they found. I'd say a lot of our larger awards, because obviously the projects range in age target and, you know, genre, but they do range in size as well. And I'd say some of our larger awards are mainly down to research, I'd say, you know, whether it be because they're using new techniques, or the subject matter is perhaps new to this audience, or maybe a bit more sensitive, so thinking about the impact. We've also been able to, you know, support some projects that are really, you know, incorporating young people in the development process, whether it be, you know, interviews as part of research or bringing them right into the writer's room, which will hopefully mean that the audience does better see themselves reflected on screen, which is, you know, the whole point ultimately.
From a content point of view, as to what we like to see in our applications, and what details we want covered, it's worth just noting that we found sort of midway through the first year that there was some detail in the budget documents and the schedule documents and what was being asked for in terms of outcomes relating to development projects. We found that it was hard to make an assessment without certain things being in place in those documents for us to be able to make that assessment. So around October last year, we revised the guidelines, both production and development, so that we created a bit of a checklist that itemised a bit more clearly what we want to see in those documents in order for us to be able to expedite that assessment more quickly. You can find the chapter and verse detail of that on pages 13 and 14 of the guidelines, both for production and development. The page numbering is the same for these checklists on both. But I just wanted to focus on a couple of areas for each fund that we do find are common in terms of what we have to remind people to provide. So with production budgets, we always ask for production insurance costs to be included, and something that sometimes gets overlooked is the fact that it has to be E&O insurance, so errors and omissions, and also the BFI needs to be named as a funding party on that insurance. There should be a 0.5% skills fund or equivalent contribution, and the idea behind this is when you're taking public money, non-recoupable, that it's the idea of giving back for being awarded that money. So where I've put equivalent, it means if you're training people or you are doing something within the production that encourages that learning, that training, then we'd see that as sort of an equal contribution, or indeed a 0.5% financial contribution to the skills fund. Financing costs. So most productions, if not all, there are some exceptions, will access the UK tax credit, and in doing so you will obtain an estimate of what you think that tax credit is going to amount to. Sometimes companies have the ability to cash flow that tax credit themselves, but often they will need to borrow money to be able to cash flow that. So the idea of financing costs being present in your budget is that you allow enough in your budget to pay for borrowing that money. So if you're borrowing money from the bank to cash flow that, there'll be interest applied to it. So the financing cost is that. Albert certification, there isn't actually a cost that you have to pay to BAFTA and Albert to achieve that certification. But what we mean by that when we ask for it to be allowed for is that time has been allowed for it. Because obviously when you're wrangling all that data and inputting it into the carbon calculator, you need to have allowed time for that, because even though it's something that can be done quite easily, it could be labour intensive if it's not sort of accounted for as you go along. So we just ask people to be aware that that is something that needs to be accounted for. Contingency, we do ask that contingency is present in all production budgets. It's sensible to have a contingency in place, and it's usually around 5% on top of total direct costs. We know that some broadcasters have differing views on what percentage of contingency should be, or whether indeed there should be one, but it is something we ask for, because it's sensible to have that in place, you know, to allow for any issues that crop up. Budget detail, this is quite a big one for me. In order to be able to assess that minimums are being met, we need to know the rate that's been used, the unit type, whether that's day, week, month, year, whatever, and what the role is, to be able to think, well, if they're asking for, if it's a half-hour special and, you know, we expect this much editor's time, we want to know how long that's for in terms of total number of units and what the rate is. And then that links quite nicely into, we also ask for minimum rates of pay to be adhered to. So national minimum wage, equity for performers, Writers Guild for script writing, and BEC2 minimums. And all of that information, we have actually got links in the guidelines, but if you sort of Google any of those minimums or regulating bodies like equity or BEC2, you can find that information online, but there's also links in the guidelines to that. And with production, the three main documents that I'm looking for to be able to do a accurate assessment are a budget document that adheres to everything that I've just said above, plus the other things that are in the guidelines, a schedule so we can see production's due to start on this date and it's due to end on this date, so that we know for the amount of money that we're being asked for, that it seems reasonable. Because obviously if you were to ask for, you know, £5 million for a week's work, we might be like, that seems a little bit off kilter. So budget schedule, and then lastly, and this is really important, and especially when you've got several streams of funding in production, is a finance plan. And that's just a document that says where your funding streams are coming from, and then what, and Hisham will touch on this, but we then ask for that to be evidenced, so we could see that you've got letters of commitment from broadcasters and whatnot. So budget, schedule, finance plan. Then moving on to development, the asks are similar, but obviously not as great because production's far more involved. But with development budgets, we ask for lines in the budget to be reasonable. So we won't fund first class travel, for example. We would expect asks to be not luxury. Budget detail the same. We want rate, unit and role to be itemised. We appreciate that with development, a lot of the time something will say, you know, allow, or it's a straight fee for this, that and the other. But our view is that if, in order to reach that cost, there must have been some kind of thought process that happened to make you think, well, we reckon it's about this much time and it'll cost about this much. Even if it's vague, we prefer to know so that we can make a fair assessment. And again, minimum rates of pay, so national minimum wage, equity, Writers Guild, BEC2, all need to be adhered to. And then the three documents that I like to see for development are budget, so adhering to the things above, schedule, which when it's a development project, it might not be as involved as a production schedule, so you wouldn't have, you know, cell by cell what's happening on each day. But even if it's just, we expect the development work to take 7 weeks over a 4-month period, that's really useful to know, because again, we can look at the whole funding ask and think, how long is that being spent over, and is it a reasonable request for the amount of effort that's being put in? And then finally, and this is really important, a list of outcomes. So with production, you expect that a full programme is going to be mastered and completed for that money that we're awarding. But with development, it's far more sort of fluid in terms of what is being asked for. So on an outcome document, I'd like to see things like, we expect 1 times 7-minute script, production Bible, a writer's workshop with 8 writers over 2 days, and sort of 3 times character design, something like that. It's really useful to have that broken down in an outcomes document, just so again we can assess what's being asked for money wise versus the outcomes that are hoping to be achieved. And that's kind of it in terms of the content of what we want to see on budgets. And the last thing from me just to say is, it's important to note that all of our awards are made inclusive of VAT. So if you have lines in your budget that are going to incur VAT, include that when you apply and put your budget documents together, because what we award is what we are able to pay out. There isn't any VAT on top of that.
We're tight for time, so I'll be brief. And I suppose it's kind of, when thinking about legal issues around the operation of the fund, most things that crop up are particular to a specific job. So there's not a great deal of things that are applicable across the board. But just thought we'd highlight a few areas that we do encounter commonly when looking at applications. So I think firstly, and with an eye on development projects, the main things to flag relate to rights in the project. And here we'd expect applicants to either own, control, or be able to obtain the relevant rights that underpin the project. So just to expand on each of those, first one, own. It's your idea. You've created it yourself. There's no third-party interests in it. Pretty simple. That's as far as you need. That's basically it. You own them. You own the intellectual property. Second situation, quite common. You might be wanting to develop a project that's based on a underlying work, a book. So in that case, you might have already identified the book, and you might have obtained an option. Say, 12-month option for a couple of grand. And then you could exercise that option, and then you have control of those rights to be able to develop it and go and produce it. Third situation is one that we can help you with. So if you're in a position where you've identified a book, say, and you think that could be adapted, that could make a television program, you might have entered into a dialogue with the rights holder, but you might not have got to the point where you've obtained the option. You could come to us with that in mind. So so long as you have a pretty decent show of intent from the rights holder, demonstrating that they'll be willing to grant you the rights and grant a formal option agreement, then you could ask us for the cost of that option and any associated legal costs in putting that together. So 3 situations: you own the rights, you control the rights, or you can get the rights. So yeah, it sounds pretty obvious that you would only apply to us if you can make the thing you want to make, but you'd be surprised at how many people can't. So that's the main thing on development projects. With production, by the time you get to a point where something's ready to be made, the rights really should have been taken care of because they are fundamental to the project. You should have full control of the rights, be it by way of ownership or option. But what we'd ask, and what any other financier or any broadcaster would ask, is for sight of what we call chain of title, which is any documents demonstrating your rights to make the thing that you want to make. So we'd look for documents evidencing that, but again, it wouldn't put you to any greater work than you would have to do for a broadcaster or another financier. So it should be taken as read that you've got that in place. The only other point I'd mention, I think, in terms of production, obviously, yeah, every project has its own quirks. I'm just trying to generalize. So it's chain of title. And the second point is, as Jill mentioned, evidence backing up each of your lines of your finance plan. So you may have a deal in principle with a broadcaster. You'd want a letter of intent. We would want sight of a letter of intent from that broadcaster confirming that they're willing to commission. It will be caveated, subject to a contract, but it's a show of intent. A tax credit estimate, potentially, showing what you anticipate receiving by way of tax credit. There's any number of options, any number of possibilities, I should say. So we want to see something backing up where you say each of your sources of finance are coming from.
Kind of to allay any fears on with anyone there, all the awards that we've given still will be honoured, no matter what. So it's not a case of if it goes over in a financial year, you'll lose that award. At the moment that money is ring fenced, and so each project will retain that award, and that should remain. But the things that we've had to do to react to this is obviously kind of open up the rescheduling of projects, which obviously we're open to, and that's subject to the producer and production company dealing with broadcaster, and we'll help in any which way we can. But we've had to kind of think from our point of view how we can safeguard our commitment, really, and so so we don't essentially lose that kind of investment loosely, in as much as this is non-recoupable, but we need to see the actual content made and on screen to be able to kind of justify the funds. So we've talked at length with all the productions and broadcasters about how we can be flexible about the scheduling and how those safety measures can be put in place from their point of view, and we can kind of relay those on to the relevant people. But also talking about payment structures as well, we obviously release funds at different increments along the production, and we've delved into that and decided to kind of change that slightly. And I think that's kind of across the board. We've tried to be as flexible as we can. We've tried to listen to industry and get this to work for industry as much as we can. While still protecting the BFI in our investment, we want to, make sure that we're not impacting production and schedule, at all, especially in these tricky times. We don't want to slow anything up. So that's kind of some of the reactions that we've had to. What are the main reasons for declining? From a production point of view, the main reasons have been things like the qualifying broadcaster isn't actually qualifying, unfortunately, or maybe we just don't feel like it hits the criteria of the fund enough, i.e., it identifies with UK culture, or it has a public service at its heart, or maybe we feel it looks too commercial in as much as it could find a different way of funding this project. We really want to kind of keep this fund for things that really need the fund to survive, really. For development, is there anything different?
Yeah, I'd say it's the same as that last point. They seem to be more sort of geared towards, commercial, not public service enough, I guess.
If I presented a script and had an artist for the characters, could you help hook us up with an animator should the application be successful, or do you strictly provide a fund for us for further development? So this is a tricky one, really, because there's a lot of us have worked in the industry, so we all have a lot of contacts. But we have discussed whether we should really be putting people in touch with each other, because you know, we just don't want to fall into that unconscious bias, or, you know, should we just stay completely independent from that kind of side of things? I think if you're really struggling, if you really don't have any contacts within that sphere, you know, there are kind of suggestions we can make rather than, you know, specifics. But we would just encourage you to get in touch with, you know, as many people as you can. And we've got, you know, thoughts and ideas about how that can be. But again, that can be more conversational, you know, further down the line if you need to. You can be allowed to cover writer searches and writer's room to get the best person.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Great.
We often get people applying, and that funds a writer's room with X amount of writers for X number of days. So it's quite a typical activity that we see.